2+ trillion going just to a very small group of extremely rich people and very big corporations. Our tax code is riddled with corruption. We could raise a lot of money and actually fix the deficit by pulling out the corruption, but the big businesses would squeal and scream because they don't like paying taxes. And for a long time, they haven't had to. In what some of my colleagues seem to think are the good old days, that's the 1950s. Good old days in America when men were men and life was good. Corporations contributed 30% of America's revenue. Corporations contributed 30% of America's revenue. And look at what's happened to it year after year, after their lobbyists have come here, after they've written checks to Republican super PACs, after they've worked this building, they're down to about under 10%. They've been down as low as 6%. And by the way, it's not because corporations got smaller and poorer in that time. They're bigger than ever. The fossil fuel industry alone made the biggest profits in corporate history, gouging American consumers after international prices went up post Putin's invasion of Ukraine. There's plenty we could do to solve the debt problem. But oh my God, the flagrancy of the lie about concern about the deficit is pretty stunning. The other thing that they have said, and I'll close with this, the other thing that they have said is, oh, we have to defend the filibuster at all costs. Oh, we can't do the nuclear option. Oh, the only time we possibly ever use the nuclear option is when the Democrats did it first. So they did a nuclear option to put their people onto the Supreme Court and blamed it on Harry Reid because he had done the same thing for the DC Circuit after they'd put up a firewall around the DC Circuit. But since then, it's been, we will never, 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 never blow up the filibuster. We will never use the nuclear option. Well, here's where we are with the parliamentarian right now. They have done an end run around getting a determination on whether this stunt that they're pulling by pretending that these tax cuts don't have any economic effect, don't add to the debt, will get reviewed by the parliamentarian. I will tell you one thing, there have probably been documents brought to the Senate floor before that contained a lie, but I can't think of one that has been brought to the Senate floor that both contained a lie and that lie's own rebuttal in the same document. The lie is that all these tax cuts for billionaires and big corporations won't add to the debt. That is imaginary, that is fake, that is not economically possible, but they say it. And then in the same document, they lift the debt limit by $5 trillion. If these tax breaks don't have any cost, don't add to the debt, why do they need to raise the debt limit by $5 trillion? The problem is, it's very hard to go into the parliamentarian's office and say, this is legit, because at the same time, I'm lying that it's free and adding $5 trillion in debt limit because it obviously isn't free. When you're dealing with a debt limit, you're dealing with banks and Treasury and people who can't participate in the Senate hothouse lie that this doesn't cost $5 trillion. And so you have these two things side by side in the same bill, the lie and its own rebuttal baked right in. How do you get that by the parliamentarian? Very hard to do, so they skip. But the problem is that sooner or later, there will be a parliamentary ruling. And maybe they hope that they've got so much steam built up that the parliamentarians will just roll over. Or maybe this whole thing just blows up and the parliamentarian says, no, you can't do that. You have a lie and its own rebuttal in the exact same document. You can't pretend that this is a true thing and therefore it's not compliant with the budget laws for all of the reasons I mentioned earlier, out of compliance with CBO, out of compliance with Joint Committee on Taxation, out of compliance with proper reporting, all of it. So what does that mean? That means that at some point, the time will come when the parliamentarian says, nope, and blows the whistle. They think that that's going to happen already, which is why they're doing the end run. And when the day comes that it actually happens, that's when they have to go to the nuclear option, because otherwise all of this will have been in vain. So we're on a path to the nuclear option. Pretty much everything Republicans have claimed to stand for is destroyed in this process. The hypocrisy alert about the deficit and the debt, and now they're raising it by huge numbers. When you have to put real numbers in the document, you simply deny them, even though the debt numbers prove the lie. When there are budget rules that we've honored for decades, going to ignore them, just blow it through. Parliamentarian, end run around the parliamentary folks, and then at the end, go nuclear after saying we'd never, 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 never do that. This whole thing is such a con and such a shame, and will cause so much damage to families dependent on Medicaid, all so they can give billions of dollars in tax breaks to big corporations and to billionaires who don't need it. In fact, their share of federal revenue has gone down by from over 30% to below 10%. They have just walked away from their responsibilities to help fund America. They left that on the backs of regular taxpayers, and it's not enough for them to be under 10%. They want more. They want to get that down to what, 5%, 4%? Nothing, be complete freeloaders? This thing is an embarrassment. And I will say I rest my case. But when you actually look at their debt limit numbers, maybe I should say they rest my case. I yield the floor.
Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. The budget that we're debating really comes down to one simple idea. The massive transfer of wealth and resources from the poor and the middle class to the ultra wealthy. What is being proposed in the Senate right now is stunning in its scope. You are talking about a piece of legislation that has such deep cuts to Medicaid. This is the program that ensures 24% of American families. 1/4 of Americans get their health insurance from Medicaid. You don't know it as Medicaid because it's called something different in each state. In Connecticut, it's called Husky. In Wisconsin, it's called Badger Care. But in every state, about 1/4 of the population gets their insurance through a Medicaid-funded program. Most of those folks are working full-time. But for one reason or another, that's where they get their insurance. You're talking about kicking millions of people off of that program. And for what? For what? To rack up the biggest bill ever on the credit card of the middle class, an explosion in debt, but also to fund a tax cut for the fabulously wealthy. This is the 2017 tax cut, which is essentially going to be mirrored, we believe, by this tax cut. The top 1% of earners got tax cuts 852 times bigger than working families in America. We don't know the final shape of this tax cut, but it won't look fundamentally different from that. This is a really bad time to be a working mom or dad in America. This week, we are passing, apparently, a massive cut in healthcare benefits for working families in order to pad the pockets of the wealthy. But we are also dealing with the Trump tariff plan. which has been a Keystone Cop-like rollout that will ultimately raise prices for every single American. Tariffs can work as part of a coordinated, thoughtful approach to trying to rebuild American industry, but they only work when you partner those tariffs together with industrial policy incentives to help promote the industry that you are trying to punish when the products come from abroad. I'm not reflexively opposed to the use of tariffs, but this use of tariffs is bananas because it's not paired with any domestic industrial policy, meaning that you're just going to get the downside, a massive increase in costs for consumers, without the upside, job creation in the United States of America. And so before I get to the insult to middle-class families that will come through the budget, let's just talk about what's going to happen with these tariffs. We know how it's going to work because we saw how tariffs worked in Trump's first term. Let me just take one specific example. In Trump's first term, he imposed a 20% escalating tariff on washing machines. And the idea was that, we want washing machines to be made in the United States instead of outside of the United States. But because he didn't pair that together with any more comprehensive help for the washing machine industry in the United States, it was only downside. And it was only downside not just because of the lack of a comprehensive policy, but also because there were no checks on the corporations that saw the tariffs as a means to gouge consumers. You have to also partner tariffs together with some accountability for corporations, for the greedy corporations that get wide-eyed when they see the tariffs and realize, well, this is an opportunity to not just pass the tariff along, but to jack up the price a little bit more and say that it was all because of the tariffs. Here's what happened on washing machines. So you got a 20% escalating tariff. We have the data. We saw what happened. The economic data tells us that the washing machine companies passed along the 20% tariff and then padded the price increase, sometimes by 15%, sometimes by 50%. But it's worse than that. The price increase was not just for imported washing machines. They also increased the price of the domestic washing machines that weren't subject to the tariff. Why not? Why not? The Trump administration won't hold us accountable for that. Nobody really looks to see whether the washing machine was made in America or not. We'll just raise the price on everything. What do you buy when you buy a washing machine as well? A dryer. So guess what happened? Even though dryers weren't subject to the tariff, the price got jacked up on the dryers as well. Dryers went up by 50% sometimes in cost, 15%, 20%. All of a sudden, prices went up for everything. Now, Trump collected a bunch of money in tariffs, $80 billion, but that was literally just middle-class people paying the additional amount to the company and the company passing it along to the government. So it was just a tax. It was just a tax. Okay, maybe you could live with that if it revitalized the domestic washing machine industry, if there were tens of thousands of people going back to jobs in that industry. But that didn't happen. I think there were one or two domestic washing machine factories that opened up, and Trump, of course, made a big deal. You know how many jobs it was in total? Less than 2,000 jobs. Less than 2,000 jobs were created for a tariff that jacked up costs for every American and resulted in $80 billion of middle-class taxes being collected by the government. That works out to about $800,000 per job. So that's what's coming at scale, not just on washing machines, but on virtually every consumer product. A big price increase, little to no domestic job creation, all the pain on the middle class. Tariffs can work, but this is not the way that they work. And so this week, Senate Republicans, instead of trying to help consumers deal with the impact of these tariffs, I mean, we're talking about huge price increases coming for American families. And this week, we could be sitting here voting for bills that cancel the tariffs or try to help middle-class families in another way. We're doing exactly the opposite. Instead of helping families deal with the impact of the tariffs, instead of holding the greedy corporations in check as they're ready to gouge consumers, we are debating a bill that would cut almost $1 trillion out of Medicaid, the program that provides insurance for a quarter of Americans, that will result in raising healthcare costs for tens of millions of Americans. And we're talking about giving a massive tax break to the billionaire CEOs of the companies that are going to be doing the price gouging, and to the companies themselves. That's outrageous. That's outrageous. If you were a regular, ordinary American, what you are being told is that you're going to have to pay huge new price increases on everything you buy. You are going to have your health care disappeared, and corporate profits and take-home pay for CEOs are going to skyrocket. Who's asking for that? What American is asking for prices to go up, my health care to be cut, and billionaires to get a big tax break? Let's start talking about these tax cuts. Okay, they're the center of this bill, right? Everything in the Trump administration is about a simple story. How do I help my Mar-a-Lago billionaire friends? So this is the old tax cut, because we don't know all the details of the new one. If you look at sort of the poorest Americans versus the richest Americans, the tax cut is 852 times bigger. But here's a back-of-the-napkin analysis of what this new tax cut is likely to look like if it's basically formed like the old one. And instead of taking the poorest Americans versus the richest Americans, instead, let's just look at sort of the bottom 60% of income earners in this country. That's roughly about everybody who makes $90,000 or less. So that's a lot of your neighbors, right? I mean, $90,000 is an income that is familiar to a lot of Americans. So under this new tax cut, if it looks like the old one, and that's the signal that we get, is that households in the top 1% are going to get an average tax cut that's 120 times bigger than the tax cut given to people who are making $90,000 or less. So that's 152 times bigger than the very poor. But let's take somebody who's making $60,000. The richest 1% are going to get a tax cut that is 120 times bigger. How is that fair? Okay, now you'd say, well, that's because they make a lot more money. So of course they're going to get a bigger tax cut. But let's do the math a different way. As a share of after-tax income, the tax cuts at the top are still more than triple the total value of the tax cut received for people with incomes in the bottom 60%. So even when you adjust for the fact that they are making more money, they are still getting a tax cut whose value is 3 times bigger than folks who are making a middle income in this country. And why? I mean, does anybody believe in trickle-down economics anymore? It has been completely discredited. And again, we have the 2017 tax cuts as evidence. Donald Trump trotted out a big promise. He said, these tax cuts for corporations and billionaires and millionaires, they'll trickle down to everybody else. And I'll tell you the number. The average worker will get a $4,000 salary increase. That was the promise. The money will trickle down. The corporations will be so generous, they'll take their giant tax cut, bigger than they even asked for. Senator Whitehouse just showed you the chart where corporations have gone from providing 30% of American tax revenue down to 10% of American tax revenue. What a great deal for corporations. Okay, that's a nice chart, that makes sense if the corporations are taking their lower tax liability and turning it around into wages. Instead, they're not. They're keeping it for themselves, for their executives, for their top shareholders. The analysis shows that that promised $4,000 salary increase as a result of the tax cuts wasn't $4,000, it wasn't $2,000, it wasn't $1,000, it wasn't $100, it was zero. Because all of that money, virtually all of that money, ended up getting gobbled up by the corporations, mainly for stock buybacks. Didn't go to increase compensation for their employees. So it's not to raise wages. I guess it's just to make rich people richer. From 2017, when that tax cut passed, that first Trump tax cut passed, until 2023, Elon Musk's wealth grew by 1,222%. I don't even know what that looks like. Jeff Bezos's grew by 96%, Zuckerberg's by 50%, Rupert Murdoch's by 50%. I use those names because those were the billionaires that were at Trump's inauguration cheerleading him into office, because they know that another big tax cut for their company and for them personally is coming. Now, I will admit to you, median income overall grew from 2017 to 2023. So everybody in the country was making more in 2023 than they were making in 2017. But median income was not growing by 50%, 96%, or 1,222%. So this is a massive tax cut, the vast majority of it going to the very, very wealthy. But what makes this even harder to understand is what Senator Whitehouse laid out for you. Most of this is just going on your credit card. Most of this is just being borrowed. And that has a consequence. The national debt potentially doubling as a result of this massive tax cut for the very, very wealthy. And it's just so heartbreaking, the hypocrisy. I mean, I could string together a 24-hour-long video of my Republican colleagues talking ad nauseum about the danger of debt, the rising deficit. We can't spend money on kids. We can't spend money on climate. We can't spend money on schools. We can't help people go to college. No. We can't do any of that. Can't do any of that because the debt, the deficit. And yet, when it comes to a billionaire tax cut, a corporate tax cut, we are going to potentially double the debt. Nobody is caring about the debt. In fact, they're rigging the rules of the Senate. They're breaking the rules of the Senate just so that they can get away with a massive increase in debt and deficit. But somewhere along the line, they said, well, you know what? We can't borrow the whole thing. We've got to make it look like we're cutting some spending. So let's cut some spending to make it at least look like it's not all borrowed. But let's make sure that the spending we're cutting only hurts poor people in the middle class. Because God forbid we can cut spending that helps the rich or the affluent. God forbid we take away some of the tax breaks that help them. And so where are the cuts coming? Medicaid. 80% of the cuts are Medicaid, $880 billion in a House bill, similar amount cutting Medicaid. Medicaid, as I said, is the program that insures 24% of Americans. At least 2/3 of those are working full-time. They just don't have health insurance through their employer, so they have to get it through Medicaid. And so when Republicans decided that they couldn't borrow the whole thing, like we'll double the national debt, but we're not going to triple the national debt, they targeted the cuts to hurt the middle class and poor people. And so I just want to end by telling you what this means in real time. I don't actually know what it means to give billionaires another $50,000 in tax breaks. I really don't know what that means. I don't know what that life is like. I don't know what it's like to have 7 houses and 4 yachts. I don't know what a billionaire does with an extra $50,000. I can't actually explain that to you. I don't understand that kind of rapacious greed. What I do know is what happens to poor people, the people who live in my neighborhood in the south end of Hartford when they lose their Medicaid. Linda lives in Sherman, Connecticut, a small town in western Connecticut. Following the economic downturn in 2008, Linda had trouble finding work. And that was tough for her because she's a cancer survivor. She had high healthcare expenses and she needed work. She was underemployed. She worked in plant nurseries and agriculture. Her husband at the same time lost his job as an auto mechanic. They lost their healthcare insurance. But then when the Affordable Care Act passed, Medicaid was expanded. More people were made eligible for Medicaid. And in 2010, she was able to sign up for Medicaid. She said, quote, "I had so much anxiety all the time about how to pay for healthcare. We were going through all of our money, and we just thought this isn't right. People shouldn't have to worry about just being basically healthy." But once she got healthcare, she was able to restart her life. Linda went back to school because now she had healthcare. She got a new degree. She found a job teaching agriculture at a local high school. But that program didn't provide health care, so she still needed that Medicaid. Medicaid, she says, just provides such a baseline for society. It allowed me to maintain my health so that I was able to continue working. The Medicaid cuts that they are talking about will destroy Medicaid expansion. In fact, some states will automatically cancel the Medicaid expansion program when these cuts are made, meaning that people like Linda all across the country are going to lose their health care. For what? For a massive tax cut for the wealthy. Emily Grinelli is a worker at one of Connecticut's biggest behavioral health and substance abuse providers. So every day she's talking to people who rely on Medicaid so that they can get help for their mental health disorder or their substance abuse disorder. And let's be honest, we all have somebody in our life who has a serious mental illness or has struggled with substance abuse. So you know these people. She wrote me a letter talking about the fact that the conversations in their therapy groups in the last month have fundamentally changed. They're actually not doing therapy any longer for mental illness or for substance abuse. They are now doing therapy for the anxiety all these people have knowing they're about to lose their health insurance. One case manager told me, she writes, that she was working with a client to find housing, and the client now just wants to stop looking because she feels like there is no point because she's going to lose her Medicaid. Republicans are going to strip her Medicaid from her. She won't be able to get her medication and services. She feels hopeless. A clinician told me about an hour-long session she had the day before. 75% of it was focused on the client's fear of losing her benefits and what that would mean for her and all the other clients. She shared with me that if there was a way for her to leave the country right now, she would. At this provider, 35% of their clients would likely lose access to mental illness and substance abuse services if these cuts go through. What are we doing? Why are we doing this? Why are we choosing? Why are my colleagues choosing to destroy healthcare for millions of Americans in order to pass a tax cut that basically helps corporations and billionaires and millionaires? It is fundamentally immoral. And I have to believe, like in 2017, when Republicans were trying to destroy the Affordable Care Act, which insured 20 million Americans, that there are a handful of Republicans who know that this isn't right, who maybe aren't ready to stop it today. Tonight's vote isn't the final vote, but might be willing to stand up to this thievery before it's too late. The people of this country who are getting killed by higher prices that are coming because of the tariffs and are going to be hurt by these Medicaid cuts and are going to be furious when the rich become richer at their expense. They are counting on just a small handful of my Republican colleagues to realize right from wrong. I yield the floor.
Would the Senator care to engage in a brief colloquy, and may I ask unanimous consent that we be allowed to do so?
The Senator from Rhode Island is recognized without objection.
I was here for your point about mental health and addiction recovery care. And as you will recall, you and I and others worked together to get the Comprehensive Addiction Recovery Act passed. And that was a very bipartisan effort because the scourge of the opioid epidemic fell across all Americans. And it was one of my happier and prouder moments when that bill actually got passed. And then when the Appropriations Committee came in behind the CARA bill and put funding in, but the bulk of the programs that we put together in CARA, bipartisan programs, were funded through Medicare, Medicaid. That's how you get reimbursement for those programs. And so, doesn't it seem peculiar that our colleagues on the other side who were so instrumental in pushing through that Comprehensive Addiction Recovery Act to help their constituents at home and who at the time showed so much sensitivity to the needs of people going through addiction recovery, through all of the stages from the initial detox to in-house treatment to sober living and on to medication-assisted treatment sometimes, and then recovery support. All of that seemed to bind us together. What on earth could be the madness that inspires them to tear all that down now when they built it within the last decade with us?
Thank you, Senator White House, first of all, for all the work you put into passing that legislation, which has given access to millions of people across the country who are struggling with addiction and recovery, access to services. Again, I say what I said in my underlying remarks. There's not a single member of the Senate who doesn't have a close family member or a friend who has struggled or is struggling with addiction. This is a nonpartisan, apolitical problem. Addiction doesn't care if you're left, right, Republican, or Democrat. And we did come together around funding these programs. And so it is hard to understand. It is heartbreaking that I'm telling you the story of one of Connecticut's biggest addiction treatment providers, and they are telling us that if these cuts go through, fully 1/3 of their clients will lose access to some or all of those services. And to your point in your initial speech, Senator Whitehouse, I mean, maybe I could understand if we were deciding to cut funding for addiction treatment because we had some other really important priority that helped regular people. Like if we said, you know what, there's a housing crisis in this country, right now we're going to have to borrow some money from addiction treatment in order to make sure that people get housed, or our schools are underfunded and teachers need to be paid more, and okay, it's really hard to cut funding from addiction treatment centers, but at least we'll get better education for our kids. That's not what we're doing. We're cutting funds for people struggling with addiction who get served by programs that we agree are important in order to fund a tax cut for corporations and super, super rich people. That's why this is fundamentally immoral. I would
yield on that very point. There's a doctrine or a principle that it's kind of a tedious economic term, marginal utility of money. And what it means in very plain terms is that if you make $60,000 a year, your last $1,000 of income is a big deal to you. That $1,000 makes an enormous difference in the quality of your life. You take that same $1,000 and you give it to somebody who is making $60 billion a year, they don't even know it's there. The marginal utility of that money in the billionaire's or mega millionaire's life is near zero. Near zero. And so if you're actually looking at the human side of the financial equation, are we not taking extremely important dollars that make an enormous difference in the lives of normal, regular people, scooping them up by the trillions, according to the graphs I showed, and delivering them to a crop of big corporations who already pay taxes too low, and mega millionaires and billionaires who won't even notice the money. It won't change a thing in their lives. They can still buy a $90,000 purse for their wife. They can still buy the 9th house. They can still buy the 190-foot yacht with its crew of 30 or 40 or 50 or whatever it is. Where is the benefit? You know, we talk about this as being a transfer of wealth from the poor and the middle class to the very rich, but it's really an evaporation of wealth, because it's not going to make a difference to people who already have more money than they can spend in the rest of their lives. They couldn't spend it if they wanted to in the rest of their lives. And so this additional thing, it's more like a trophy. And it reminds me, when I was growing up, people talking about FDR, you know, recalling his presidency, and talking about JFK while he was president, and shortly thereafter. I was alive during JFK's life. And people used to say, well, you know, the good thing about electing those rich people is that they're too rich to steal. You don't have to worry about them. They're too rich to steal. FDR never stole a nickel, as best I can tell. JFK never stole a nickel, as best I can tell. This crop of creepy billionaires, what happened to too rich to steal, Senator Murphy?
I mean, and it's thievery masked by a bogus economic argument that says the money will eventually find its way down to everybody else. And that is not true. That has never been true. In fact, the opposite is often true. You know, the billionaire class is sometimes referred to as sort of citizens of everywhere, right? They're global citizens. They globetrot from homes in the United States and Europe and the islands. But that's also where their money ends up going as well. It used to be that the richest guy in your community was, you know, investing only in your community. But today, when we pad the pockets of the uber wealthy, that money either does not get spent or it ultimately gets delivered to investments that flow into economies all over the world. These tax cuts don't end up back in America. To the extent the money gets spent anywhere, it gets spent in international index funds. So the theory of the case, which has always been cover for simply delivering more and more excessive resources to the very, very wealthy, has never worked. But it works even less now when in a global international economy, the very, very wealthy have options to invest in the United States or often for higher returns, investing somewhere else.
And it looks to me, if I could reclaim my time for a moment and ask you another question, it looks to me a bit like as they're destroying Medicaid, which, as you pointed out, serves a quarter of American households and is essential in those households because it's granny's nursing home care, it's your sister's or wife's childbirth delivery in the hospital, or it's your colleague or friend or family member's opioid recovery treatment, swept away for unnecessary and unfair tax cuts to billionaires and big corporations. But then you move just beyond this immediate budget bill and you look over at Elon Musk and his little muskrats are doing to Social Security. And what they're saying about Social Security, and it looks like not only do they want to gut Medicaid through this budget reconciliation bill, but they also are trying to wreck the administration and operations of Social Security, trying to clear out the workforce that makes it work, sending their creeps in to probe into the data systems that support it, Who knows what damage has been done to the data systems or what extraction of data has been done? We don't know. They've never answered questions. They lie and say it's a Ponzi scheme. They refer to it as riddled with fraud when there's almost no fraud at all, 1% at best. So they're trying to discredit Social Security. They're trying to undermine its operations, and they're talking about an interruption in benefits. In fact, talking kindly about an interruption in benefits, with the Secretary of Commerce saying, if we had an interruption in benefits, my mother, who is a Social Security recipient, wouldn't even notice. Well, yeah, she's living in her billionaire son's house. Of course she wouldn't notice, duh. But the people who would complain about losing their check, that's probably fraudsters. And so it would actually be beneficial to have an interruption benefits, because that's how we could root out some of the fraud, like there is fraud. Again, feeding the lie that there is fraud. What conclusions do you reach when you see this pattern of activity targeting Social Security, even if an attack on it is not in this bill per se?
I thank Senator for the question. Listen, I read it as just a different kind of thievery. So what we're talking about here is this massive thievery from Medicaid recipients so that we can pass along this big tax break for folks that don't need it. But my sense is that the billionaire and investment and Wall Street class is really upset that there are still a few remaining government programs that they haven't gotten their hands on, that they haven't operationalized in a way to make themselves money. They've had their eyes on Social Security for decades. Yep. You remember, George Bush proposing privatizing Social Security, which is essentially just taking that big lump of money and handing it to the investment managers so that they can skim some money off the top. They also look at schools the same way, I think, Senator Whitehouse. They've been discrediting public education to the point where now they don't think the Department of Education needs to exist. And why? Why? Because they ultimately want to do the same thing for our public schools. They want to privatize our elementary schools, our middle schools, our high schools, so that they can have private equity funds owning the schools, providing some form of education, but just seeing our kids as a source of profit. So you can tell me if I'm wrong about this, but my sense is that the theft happens in all sorts of different ways, sometimes in just a transfer, Medicaid recipients losing, billionaires winning, but sometimes by taking government programs and turning them, instead of something that tries to work for the common good, as a program that just gets turned into a vehicle for profit for the very, very wealthy.
Particularly when there's so much money to be made and so much flows through Social Security. If you take it over by wrecking it and then sending in your private equity friends and tech bros to get it operational again, and then let them slice off a share for themselves by privatizing either it or its operations, you have created a massive new revenue stream for the super rich. So with that, I see that there are a few colleagues on the other side who have come over. It may be that it's their turn, so I will, Senator Murphy, you cool to yield the floor? I will yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Kentucky.
We're gathered here to talk about the budget. We're going to be voting on a budget resolution shortly, and I'm concerned. I'm concerned that there's so much enthusiasm among conservatives and Republicans for cutting waste and cutting fraud and quit spending $2 million on sex changes in Guatemala and $3 million on girl-centric climate change in Brazil, $4.8 million on social media influencers in Ukraine. I'm excited by eliminating all of that waste. I've been calling for it for years. But I'll tell you what worries me. What worries me is that so many things in Washington are smoke and mirrors. On the one hand, it appears as if all of this great savings is happening. But on the other hand, the resolution before us will increase the debt by $5 trillion. So which is it? Are we cutting spending or are we expanding the debt? If we expand the debt at $5 trillion, that will be an expansion of the debt equal to or exceeding everything that happened in the Biden years. Now, which is it? I thought we had an election. And the other side is complaining loudly that, oh my goodness, there's going to be too much cut in spending. And our side is saying, no, no, no. And I'm looking at the numbers. The budget resolution is going to add $5 trillion over about a 2-year period. So they're going to add more than $2 trillion a year to the debt. In what world is that conservative? They say there is a difference between the parties, and yet when you look at the numbers, when you look at the fact that this budget resolution is going to borrow $5 trillion, you scratch your head and say, what's up here? Is there somebody not really being honest with us? They're going to borrow $5 trillion. And yet they'll say, well, the spending is coming down, and we've put these numbers in the budget that will reduce spending. If so, why are we borrowing $5 trillion? The reason they're going to ask the Republicans and the Democrats, but it'll be mostly Republicans voting for this debt, the reason they're asking for it is because they're anticipating that's what they'll need. They're also anticipating that, it's kind of embarrassing, really, to talk about debt. It's extremely embarrassing for Republicans who say they're conservative to be adding $5 trillion in debt and voting for it. So they don't want to do it very often. Let's try to spread it out a long time. Let's try to get through the 2026 election. Let's try to get to 2027 before we have to have this embarrassment brought back in front of us. But the embarrassment and the shame is coming much quicker. We're going to get to the end of September 30th. That's the end of the fiscal year for our federal government. And the American people at that time will be told, hopefully someone in the media notices this, that the deficit for this year will be over $2 trillion. The estimates are that there will be about $2.2 trillion. And we're going to borrow $5 trillion. Now, some would argue, yeah, but we need to give them a chance. We need to give them a chance because the spending number actually looks like they might reduce spending. But here's the problem. The spending number is lower, but this bill also adds $325 billion in new spending, $150 billion for the military-industrial complex, another $175 billion for the border, but that's new money. How much money did we spend last year? A little over $7 trillion. But that's not enough, according to all the people here on my side today that are going to vote for this budget. They want more than last year. Well, if last year was $7.1 trillion, that must mean they're going to want $300 billion more than that. But the number in the bill says no, $6.5 trillion. So they're saying, no, we're going to spend less. I say, you know what? I've seen the way this place operates, and I don't trust either party. Why? Because I've seen the deficit and the debt grow and triple since I've been here. It's $36 trillion. Now, I voted against every last penny of it. I've voted against the spending bills. I've voted to balance the budget. I've introduced budgets that balance over 5 years. But the one thing that would happen, even if I had my way and I could introduce and my budget would be accepted, there'd have to be some debt accumulation. So what I'm offering today is let's accumulate some debt. Let's raise the debt ceiling. Never voted for this before, but I'm willing to vote for 3 months, about $500 billion to raise the debt ceiling. Why? Because it has to happen. Why don't I want to give them $5 trillion? Because then you're just turning your back and they're going to do whatever they always do. What does the swamp always do? Take your money, borrow money, spend and borrow. It continues unabated. But if you wanted to keep your Congress on a leash, if you wanted to have leverage, to say, well, what if you're not being honest with me? What if in 3 months the deficit's over $2 trillion? And what if in 3 months the spending levels aren't $6.5 trillion, but in actuality $7.4 trillion? How would we then rebuke you? How would we stop you? How would we stop the spending? Well, the way we would stop the spending is by not giving you any more borrowing. So what I'm proposing today is an amendment that will raise the debt ceiling by $500 billion. To me, that's an extraordinary amount of money, but your government spends it so darn fast that that's about 3 months worth of spending. But there's nothing conservative about raising the debt ceiling $5 trillion. It boggles the mind to try to comprehend how anyone who is self-describing themselves as conservative would vote to increase the debt by $5 trillion. It makes utterly no sense. But it also is free rein for the spenders because they've got $5 trillion they can spend. In recent years, on occasion, they haven't even put a number in there. Probably the only reason we're getting a number is because the rules of the budget require a number. But what they've been doing, both parties, they've been just saying, well, why don't we just borrow money for 2 years or 3 years? And many people argue, many on the other side of the aisle say, we shouldn't even have these votes at all. Why have a debt ceiling at all? Let's just let it spin out of control. Has anybody ever seen the debt clock? Go to the debtclock.org and watch the numbers spinning wildly out of control. Now, some will say deficits don't matter. This was the Cheney family. Dick Cheney famously said deficits don't matter. But the thing is, they really do, because you have to pay interest on the debt. We're paying about $1 trillion in interest. So the largest item in our spending now, bigger than our military, is actually the interest. Over the next 10 years, we're going to pay about $14 trillion in interest. I think it's actually probably worse than that. That's what the estimates are now, but it is literally out of control. And you say to yourself, how would we rein in spending? You have to look at everything. Every item we spend money on has to be looked at. You have to look across the board at everything. But what we have is the current administration says we're not going to look at Social Security, despite what the other side says about Social Security. Nothing's going to happen to Social Security. They're not going to fix it. They're not going to make it better. They're not going to reduce anything. Social Security is going to be untouched. So is Medicare. But then there are reports and complaints saying, well, we shouldn't touch Medicaid either. And then people say, food stamps, we can't touch food stamps. Well, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and food stamps comprise all the money that comes into our government. They're about $5 trillion worth. That's about what we pay in taxes. So the government brings in about $5 trillion and spends $7 trillion. It's about a $2 trillion overdraft. We're $2 trillion in the hole every year, and we're up to about $37 trillion total. But how would we actually get there? If you're taking off the table Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, and food stamps, those 4 items are about $5 trillion, pretty close to it. So if you take all the entitlements off the table, what are you left with? And people love and they get excited about the terrible foreign aid. I do too. I think it's the lowest hanging fruit. It's the most egregious of the spending. It's the easiest to cut. But, I forced a vote on that 2 weeks ago, and we got no Democrat votes. In fact, I don't think there is a Democrat in Congress who will vote to cut 1 penny. I'd like to do that sometime, introduce a bill to cut a penny or to cut $1 to see if they would. Let's cut $1 from the $2 million that they spend doing sex change surgery in Guatemala with U.S. tax dollars. Will the Democrats support a bill to cut $1? Probably not. They would probably insist, even if they admitted the program was egregious or horrible or out of normalcy, they would probably insist the money be spent somewhere else. And that's sort of the debate we have over time. I have a bill called Bonuses for Cost Cutters, which says that if you are in charge of a budget for government, let's say you're in charge of $12 million at the Department of Energy. If you save $1 million, you would actually get a personal bonus for the federal employee as an incentive. When I put this forward, the main complaint that usually comes from across the aisle is they're okay with giving federal workers bonuses for saving money, but they insist that the money not go back to the Treasury. This is the big debate that's going on also. What Elon Musk has done and Doge has done is absolutely commendable, and we need more of it. The whole place is rotten and it needs to be shaken up, and we need to look for waste. But there's going to be another debate. Is that waste going to come back, and are we going to vote on it? Are we going to codify it? Or are we going to make it real by lowering our numbers? But the only way we would have any leverage on either party is by only giving them a little taste of the money. Don't give them so much money they're wallowing in it and it comes out as fast as the Federal Reserve can print it. Give them about 3 months worth. Let's see how they do in 3 months. If the spending totals that are in the bill come forward in 3 months, and those are the spending totals that Congress approves, I'd be pretty satisfied with that. In fact, I've told them the bill on large, I'm for continuing the tax cuts. I'm for keeping the tax cuts permanent. I voted for them in 2017. I'm for reducing spending, which on the surface, some of the numbers look better, but I'm just not for borrowing $5 trillion. If we're doing a good job, if we're doing a better job, why are we borrowing $5 trillion? Something doesn't add up. Something is fishy. If we're going to do such a good job, and if we have transformed government, if we are different than the other side of the aisle, and we really are for less spending and less debt, why are we borrowing more money than we've ever borrowed at one time in the history of the country? This will set a record. I believe $5 trillion will be the most that's ever been borrowed in one fell swoop. This will be a vote, and I think an ignominious one, in which professed conservatives stand up, stand forward, and vote for more debt than Congress has ever voted for at one period of time. It just disappoints me. I'm so disappointed. But I'm also disappointed because I think within a few months, when the American people see this, particularly when Republicans at home see, oh my goodness, I heard all this good news about cutting foreign aid and cutting all this crazy spending around the world, but the deficit's still $2 trillion this year. And then they're going to scratch their heads, and maybe they give the Republicans another 6 months to look. And then they're going to find that another $1 trillion has been borrowed in another 6 months. And they're going to find we're 2 years into a new Republican administration with a Republican majority in the Senate and a Republican majority in the House, and we're going to borrow $5 trillion. Something doesn't add up here. Someone needs to stand up and say something. Someone needs to give conservatives, if we have conservatives in this body, an alternative. That's what my amendment will be. My amendment will be an alternative. Instead of borrowing $5 trillion, sticking our head in the sand and saying, oh, please be nice to us and do what you promised and spend less money. No, we give them 3 months and we say, prove to us that you will, for the first time, adhere to your word. And it isn't just a couple individual people. This is the history of the institution. Occasionally, through the last several decades, there have been people come forward and they put forth rules. There was Graham-Rudman-Hollings. There were different rules that said you have to pay as you go. So if somebody brought up $300 billion in new spending, you'd have to cut $300 billion from somewhere else. But you know what's happened? These things have been evaded time and time again. Why are people like me cynical of the process? Why do people like me not believe them when they say they're going to cut spending? Because they've always gone back on their word. They exempt themselves from the rules they create. Graham-Rudman-Hollings, pay-as-you-go, would have been effective, but it's been evaded by Congress 60, 70 times now. So I say trust but verify. I say trust, accept your colleagues if they say they're really going to do this, but give them 3 months worth of borrowing. Don't give them 2 years worth of borrowing. Don't give $5 trillion. Don't put yourself on record. Today, if this is passed, or tomorrow morning early, if this is passed, Republicans who vote for this will be on record as being more fiscally liberal than their counterparts. They will vote to borrow more money than the Democrats have ever borrowed. So there really is a disconnect here. Something is not as it appears. There is a smoke and mirrors. There is this great enthusiasm across the land for what is happening, and I share that. I share President Trump's desire to balance the budget. I'm pleased with his cabinet. I'm super pleased with having Elon Musk and Doge and these young people look for waste. I'm for all of that and more. But if it's going to be reflected in something, we have to borrow less. If we're still borrowing the same amount, maybe it isn't real. Maybe we're just talking about things and we're not actually doing them. It is hard to cut spending. Everybody wants something. Everybody wants something from government. But there is no such thing as something for nothing. It has to come from somewhere. Most people know this in their daily lives. As you work, you get something for work and you feel good about yourself because you've worked for something. You can't simply just hand out money to people. You can't print up money like it grows on trees. But I can tell you there's an absolute historical record of abuse by both parties. But what saddens me in particular for Republicans is Republicans will go on record today to increase the debt more than the Democrats ever had. The new world's record for accumulation of debt, the new world record for expanding debt in our country will belong to the Republican Party with this. This is a sad day. I will vote against this bill and object to it unless we get rid of this enormous amount of borrowing. If we get rid of the $5 trillion and adopt my amendment, I'll vote for the bill. The bill would borrow, if my amendment were passed, $500 billion. Is it enough? No, we'd have to do it again. We'd come back in 3 months. But this is the idea of trust but verify. If the promises are real, and if the big spenders in both parties are doing a good job, when they come back and prove to us that they've actually done something they have never done in the past, they have changed their ways, and they're not going to keep adding massive debts year after year, then we give them another 3 months. If they do a great job, maybe we give them 6 months. But we don't give big spenders in Washington who have a terrible history with the debt, we don't give them no leash at all, no controls at all. $5 trillion here, spend it however you want. We don't do that. At least we profess not to on our side. So my amendment will give all members of the body a chance to say, do you want continued oversight of your government by looking at the debt ceiling periodically, or you just want to wash your hands? I say if we wash our hands, we speed up the demise of our country. I think now is an inflection point. The stock market in the last 2 days lost over $6 trillion. We live in perilous times, and I think the people who just keep going on their merry way saying, we'll just do the same thing, and we'll tell the people it's a little different than the other side. Maybe they'll vote for us this time. Maybe they won't. I don't think it's going to happen. I think the people are frustrated. I think the people are annoyed. And I think the people are frankly worried. The people who've been trying to save and are getting closer to retirement are looking at their retirement nest egg and saying, oh my goodness, look what's happened to us. Where are we going? Part of that message is an indictment of tariffs that I think millions of investors think tariffs are a bad idea. But part of it's an indictment over our massive accumulation of debt. The fact that we're spending $7 trillion and bringing in $5 trillion. So I hope the body will consider my amendment, and maybe I'll be shocked. Maybe we'll get enough votes from both sides of the aisle to actually have a shorter leash and have more perspective and more concern and oversight for what our spending will do. So I recommend a yes vote on my amendment, which will change the debt ceiling from $5 trillion to $500 billion.
Mr. President.
Senator from Idaho.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate the remarks that have just been given by my colleague from Kentucky. I think the main message we need to hear there, and what I'm going to talk about, is that the problem we have in America is not that our taxes are too high or too low, but that our spending is too high. And Republicans today, I'm confident, will be unified in delivering, as President Trump calls it, one big, beautiful bill for the American people. But what does this bill include? The fiscal year 2025 budget resolution fulfills promises to secure America's borders, increase our national defense, unleash our energy potential, and finally start to get our house in order. I agree completely with my colleague. We have got to reduce our spending, and this bill contains a target with a minimum floor of $2 trillion in spending reduction in our federal budget. Importantly, it also lays the groundwork to make permanent and build on the 2017 Trump tax cuts
so that American families can keep more of their hard-earned money to stop financing Washington's spending problem. Our conference is united in preventing an over $4 trillion tax hike on American families and businesses, and delivering additional tax relief to those who have suffered for 4 years now under inflation. We are united in making this proven tax policy permanent to provide the certainty that businesses need to make long-term investments that drive growth and stability for our families as they save and plan for the future. We're also unified in our resolve to restore fiscal sanity and know that the best way to do so isn't to tax hardworking Americans more. It is to spend less. While many tend to focus on the policy disagreements that occur, as they should in these halls, the reality is that Republicans are completely unified in delivering on President Trump's agenda, a major portion of which is to restore the economic prosperity experienced under his previous presidency. Let's just look back for a minute about the bill that we are trying to extend and make permanent now. Most Americans don't pay attention to the minutia of tax policy. But if you ask them, the majority will tell you that they'd rather keep more of their money than let the government spend it. And that's exactly what the 2017 tax cuts did. Those Trump tax cuts lowered tax rates for the overwhelming majority of Americans, simplified the tax code, and encouraged companies to do business in the United States instead of abroad. In addition to lowering rates across the board, it provided targeted tax relief to the middle-class working families by doubling the standard deduction and the child tax credit, and to small businesses by providing a new 20% deduction, enabling America's entrepreneurs to create new jobs, increase workers' wages, and reinvest in their business. The majority of the benefits from the Trump tax cuts, contrary to what you've heard all day from the other side, flowed to working middle-class families, the bottom 50% of earners receiving the largest reduction in average tax rates at 17.3%. Contrary to the claims that you've heard all day on the floor today that benefits were only for billionaires and corporations, the Trump tax cuts actually made the tax code even more progressive, meaning that the highest income earners today pay a greater share of all taxes than they did before. And if we can extend this tax cut, that will continue to be the case. The generational reforms we made in 2017 were designed to strengthen investment, boost economic growth, increase take-home pay, reduce poverty, and make America strong, and it worked. Not only did taxpayers keep more of their hard-earned money, but a growing economy powered median household to an all-income to an all-time high. The labor market improved. Workers saw record wage growth, and the unemployment rate fell dramatically to 3.5%, the lowest in 50 years. And the lowest income workers experienced the largest wage growth. There was capital formation explosion in the United States, and corporate inversions, corporations leaving America, stopped and became a thing of the past as companies came back home to America and became the place to form capital and do business again. All Americans reap the benefits of a booming economy. Extending this current proven tax policy and building on it is the best way to restore economic prosperity and opportunity for working families, many of whom are struggling to recover from the historic inflation of the last 4 years. Tonight, I expect we'll hear once again the politics of fear, as my Democrat colleagues claim all sorts of dire things that will happen, including that we're just going to cut taxes for the wealthy so that we can do our own projects and benefit the wealthy and corporations. This attack has been used for nearly a decade, and it's just as false now as it has been in the past. Americans should not be scared by these falsehoods. What they should be alarmed by is what my colleagues and I are committed to preventing: the largest tax hike in history that will occur if we do not extend the current Trump tax cuts. This chart shows, of all these dollars of tax relief that we are talking about, contrary to the argument that they go to the wealthy, $2.6 trillion of this tax hike goes to people in households making less than $400,000 a year. And the vast majority of that goes to people in the middle, lower, and upper middle income categories. Families of four making $80,000 will see a $1,700 tax hike if we don't extend this tax relief. 20 million small businesses will see their rates go up to 43.4%. The child tax credit will be cut in half. The standard deduction will be cut in half. The lowest income earners in America are the ones who are benefiting the most from this legislation today. Republicans are united in our efforts to make this work. Now, one of the things we're focusing on is making the tax cuts permanent. Not only are we focused on extending these policies, but we're committing to make this growth in our economy permanent so we don't have to face these dire consequences in the future. Permanent tax policies promote stability and lead to more pronounced economic effects than temporary ones. Making these tax cuts permanent will provide businesses with the certainty and the stability they need to make the long-term investments that drive growth, accelerate productivity, and increase prosperity across all segments of our economy. Studies find that a permanent extension of the TCJA would increase long-run GDP by 1.1% and increase after-tax income for all Americans of all income levels. Making the small business deduction alone permanent is estimated to create 1.2 million jobs annually over the first 10 years, increasing to 2.4 million jobs in the long run. The President's Council of Economic Advisors just released an analysis that says that extending the Trump tax cuts combined with other pro-growth economic policies that we are pursuing now would boost the level of short-run GDP growth by 3.3 to 3.8% and long-run real GDP growth by 2.6 to 3.2%. Now, what does that mean? It means we're going to see that it will raise annual real wages by $2,100 to $3,300 per worker, increase real annual take-home pay for median income households with 2 children by roughly $4,000 to $5,000, save over 4 million full-time equivalent jobs from being destroyed, and facilitate $100 billion of investment in distressed communities. That analysis also projects that extending these tax cuts, together with the full suite of the Trump administration's policies, such as deregulation, which the CEA previously estimated would add 0.1 to 0.2 percentage points to real GDP growth over a decade, is expected to result in a 3% annual real GDP growth rate over the next 10 years. Now, what does that mean? According to CEA, that 3% growth in our GDP will result in $4.1 trillion of additional revenue to the Treasury to help deal with our national debt. $4.1 trillion. To unleash that growth, the best way to make these tax cuts permanent is by using a current policy baseline. This is the scoring method that more accurately reflects reality. The average American easily understands that there is a difference between a tax increase and a spending cut. However, there's an inherent bias in Congress's scoring process where tax policy is treated different than spending policy. If tax rates are scheduled to increase, like they are right now if we don't act, preventing that tax hike is counted as a cost in uncollected future revenue. But many spending programs are assumed to be extended beyond their expiration. So the spending just continues and continues and continues unabated, which the budget rules say don't have any cost. That's what we're trying to fix today in this bill. In fact, there is $2.5 trillion in spending that is automatically extended by our budget rules over the next 10 years under a current policy baseline that they currently use. Even the Obama White House has used a current policy baseline for tax policy. They recognize that there's a difference between increasing taxes and cutting spending. In 2013, the Obama White House stated that current policy baseline is the appropriate reference point, since it measures changes relative to the status quo, rather than the mix of expiring provisions and policy changes that would likely never be implemented. Interpreted, what they said was exactly what I've been saying. President Obama and his team said, you can't say that just keeping the tax rates where they are and not raising them is the same as spending more money. We need to level the playing field and sever the connection that creates a tax and spend budgeting process in Congress. And that's another thing we're going to do today. Critics who have been strangely silent over the years as trillions of dollars in spending has been automatically extended under a current policy baseline now take offense to correcting that bias toward forcing federal spending. As applied only to tax policy, those critics assert that we'll be increasing the deficit by using a current policy baseline, or we're using this baseline to hide the cost. Let me be very clear. We're not hiding the score that JCT or CBO would assign to the bill under a current law baseline. In fact, I like to see that score. It shows the amount of the tax increase that my colleagues on the other side are trying to push onto the American people. But let's be fully transparent. Both an estimate based on the current policy and one based on the current law will be released when we consider this bill on the Senate floor. And then Americans can see what kind of savings have been given to them by not raising their taxes. Under our current existing tax regime, the revenue to the GDP ratio this year will be about 17.1%. Meaning we will raise taxes for the federal treasury under our current tax policy of about 17.1% of GDP on a current policy baseline. It will also be about the same next year if we don't let the taxes go up, meaning that the revenue will not appreciably change. Yet my colleagues on the other side say it's going to spike a hole in the deficit because, why? Because they won't get their hands on that $4 trillion of new tax revenue out of the American people. This would not increase debt relative to GDP. It would simply prevent a tax increase. And we need to be honest about what those tax increases would and would not do. Those who say we should let taxes go back up say, wow, then we could use it to pay down the national debt some more. Every tax increase that Congress has adopted for as long as I can remember was not used to pay down the national debt. It was used by Congress to spend more money. We've got to take that pressure off of spending as well. Congress does not have a revenue problem. It has a spending problem. Senate Republicans are united in our desire to take concrete steps to address our deficit and get our fiscal house in order. Because the bill we're debating today is within the confines of reconciliation, the scores and numbers that we'll be discussing don't reflect that full fiscal picture. In order to have an honest discussion of what needs to be done, there's an acknowledgement that needs to be made that other factors are also at play that can generate economic growth and reductions in spending. What am I talking about? Economic growth. As I indicated in one of the charts that we just had up, the estimates from the CEA are that if we make the tax policy permanent, the confidence that will give our economy and the boost that it will give our economy in proper tax incentive policy will grow the economy by as much as $4 trillion of new revenue to the federal treasury. The president is also directing impacts in the government through his efforts and the Department of Government Efficiency to aggressively cut waste, fraud, and abuse from our government programs. Spending on federal government programs has ballooned in recent years. We have a responsibility to evaluate these spending increases and ensure that these programs work effectively and efficiently for everyone. The president has also undertaken and will likely pursue more deregulation. Deregulation has had as big an impact on revenues and economic growth as tax policy has in the past, and we should recognize that. The bottom line is that in addition to the action that Congress can take, there are activities that the president is currently engaged in that will impact our fiscal policy by either reducing spending or increasing revenue, and we should also take those into consideration. Congress must begin the process of restoring fiscal sanity by achieving deficit reduction and spending reforms as the best way to achieve that goal. In contrast, imposing the largest tax increase in our country's history would be counterproductive by easing the gliding path and making it easier for more spending. We will have a very robust debate in the weeks ahead about the best way to deliver on President Trump's agenda, and I look forward to those discussions. The budget resolution unlocks the process for us to strengthen our national security, secure our borders, permanently extend the Trump tax cuts, and provide additional middle-class tax relief. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from California.
Mr. President, the Trump administration is corrupt. It is easily the single most corrupt and lawless administration in American history. And it would be exceedingly difficult to debate that simple proposition, because notwithstanding all of the whataboutism we occasionally hear, there is really no denying it. The self-dealing by unelected billionaires like Elon Musk, the presidential meme coins, the quid pro quos, the dismissal of corruption cases in exchange for help on the president's policy agenda, the dismissal of national security personnel, not on the basis of national security, but on the word of right-wing cranks, the deportation of someone to a maximum security prison in another country on the basis of a clerical error, the mass illegal firings, the reckless use of commercial apps for classified information, the scorning of court orders, the phony math to hide the deficit exploding impact of tax cuts for billionaires, the attacks on Social Security, calling it a Ponzi scheme, when people are making the attacks, those that are making the attacks are the con men who want to raid the hard-earned retirement funds belonging to our nation's seniors and veterans. The swamp is full, it is overflowing, and Donald Trump is standing right in the middle of it, up to his ears in the filth. And it is plainly obvious to anyone who is watching that the president simply doesn't care about anyone but himself. Not you, not your families, certainly not the American people. He is in it for himself. While your retirement savings are being wiped out, he's playing the back nine at his country club. Oh, caddy, would you hand me a number 6? Now the Trump administration's abundant corruption doesn't happen in a vacuum. His corrupt self-dealing doesn't just boost his own bottom line and that of his wealthy donors. It hurts everyday Americans. It hurts Californians. It hurts all of us. So let me give you some examples. Days before Donald Trump was sworn in, he took one of the most obviously corrupt actions of his political career. And that's saying quite a lot. The president took to Twitter to announce that he was launching his own cryptocurrency, a meme coin. He would maintain a vast ownership of the stock in it, but anyone in the world could buy in, from a Chinese national under indictment in the US to any sultan in the Middle East looking to buy influence. and predictably, the meme coin just skyrocketed. On paper, he appears to have made billions on it. It's possible he made more in one day from this joke cryptocurrency than he had made in his entire life up to that point. You might recall a press conference he had when a reporter asked him at the beginning of his presidency, are you going to continue to traffic in this coin and this currency that's making you a lot of money? And the president's question to him was, well, how much is it making me? And when the reporter said, well, it's making you a lot, the president was delighted. Turned to, presumably off camera, Elon Musk or one of the billionaires and said, well, that may not be much to these guys. And there was great laughter to be had. The corruption is out in the open. And the thing about this new currency is that it's a message to anyone who wants to curry favor with the president. Whether it's foreign governments or oligarchs or wealthy Wall Street billionaires, it gives them a chance to literally buy Donald Trump's favor directly, corruptly, and unmistakably. Now, who does that ultimately hurt? Short answer is everyone else. So maybe a billionaire is buying a bigger tax break, but that means hardworking Americans are going to have to pay for it. Or maybe it's someone under indictment for fraud who can now get their case dismissed by Donald Trump's DOJ for the right price in meme coin. That hurts every American because it just invites all kinds of further corruption. Now the president's kids are in the crypto business, and there are even more opportunities for graft. In other parts of the world where there are long traditions of such corruption, they would be called princelings. There's a name for them. They're called princelings. Well, congratulations, America. We now have our own princelings, and they are called Eric and Don Jr. Now, as it turns out, it's not just by buying Trump meme coin or the kids' crypto investments that may help get the Justice Department to drop your case or get the Justice Department to go after your enemies. Since Donald Trump's first day in office, he has methodically and meticulously purged the Department of Justice of anyone who is not blindly loyal to him. Not loyal to the rule of law, mind you, not loyal to their oath, but loyal to the person of Donald Trump. That is and will be the only standard in this department. It is not a coincidence that the top 3 lawyers running the Justice Department, including Attorney General Pam Bondi, are all former Trump criminal defense lawyers. Their client was and always will be the multiply indicted and convicted felon who occupies the Oval Office. So how does this hurt everyday Americans? Well, it does so in a few ways. First, it means that the department's resources will be focused on all the wrong things. The DOJ should be focused on keeping Americans safe. It should be focused on cracking down on violent criminals and addressing the fentanyl crisis. It should be hunting down fraudsters who scam Americans. But instead, they're focused on retribution, on going after Trump's enemies, on helping those who were loyal to him, and wasting countless hours and resources in the process. But also, Trump is using the DOJ now to protect his friends and allies. You don't have to look any further than the case in New York. The mayor of New York, Eric Adams, indicted on serious corruption charges. A mayor who then, seeing the writing on the wall, pursues a kind of quid pro quo with the president. He goes down to Mar-a-Lago, and the quid pro quo eventually becomes as plain as day. It is out in the open. The president's own border czar does a joint interview sitting next to the mayor on Fox and Friends on their couch to lay out the stark quid pro quo in exquisite detail. All that was left unsaid by Trump's border czar were the words, "or else." The mayor would get his case dismissed, and in exchange, he would pursue the president's policy agenda when it comes to immigration. If the mayor was guilty of serious corruption, of bribery, of providing political favors to foreign nations in exchange for lavish gifts, and even the Trump DOJ doesn't deny the evidence against him, that just doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter, not if he is a political ally of the president. So who does that hurt? Well, it hurts New Yorkers. It invites more corruption in the city of New York. But this trend, of course, hurts everyone. A big corporation screwing over consumers can seemingly prevent investigation or prosecution now by kissing the ring. Just takes a trip to Mar-a-Lago. A corrupt politician can continue to leverage government resources for their own gain, knowing that they may never be held accountable for their actions. You can even storm this building, and they did. You can storm right into this chamber, and they did. You can trample American democracy. You can beat police officers in the name of this president, and not only will your prosecution be dropped, but you will be pardoned and celebrated. And beyond that, the public servants who prosecuted you will be removed, replaced, or demoted. They will be purged. By using the Justice Department as a shield to protect his friends and a sword to go after his enemies, it is the American people who will lose. Now, just down the street from the DOJ, at the Food and Drug Administration, there is something less talked about, but also quite sinister going on. Elon Musk and his many companies owns one, among his many companies, owns one called Neuralink. Now, this is a company that is aiming essentially to implant computers into people's brains. Now, while I am not personally one to want a Elon-sponsored device shoved into my cerebral cortex, I do believe in responsible innovation, and I even celebrate it. But unfortunately for responsible innovation, within weeks of entering office, Elon and Doge had fired essentially the entire team at the FDA's Office of Neurological and Physical Medicine Devices. You guessed it, the office in charge of reviewing his product. Gone. That sent a pretty clear message through the agency: get on board with Elon or you're out. It feels like par for the course for Elon, but it is really unprecedented in this country. Especially damaging is the fact that this also occurs at a time when they are just massively laying off people at the FDA. Huge cuts in the folks that make sure our medicine and food are safe. Not only does that mean life-saving medicine doesn't get reviewed and deployed faster to the American people, it means that dangerous stuff gets into circulation much longer before it can be stopped. Or maybe if it just gets to slip through with a wink and a nod and a big enough contribution to the Trump meme coin. And if you thought Elon stopped at the FDA, well, I have some more news for you. Doge has pulled the exact same move at other agencies, providing oversight over him or with which he has contracts. The FAA, where Elon Musk has desires for contracts for his Starlink satellite system. The Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, where Elon's companies face a significant threat of oversight, or at least they did before he made that agency largely go away. Or NASA, where Elon's SpaceX has billions in contracts. The Pentagon, more contracts for Elon. And now FDA. You can't find more corrupt self-dealing than that. Not in our history. You may be able to find it in other countries, but until this administration, you couldn't find it here. Now, in the category of good news, I guess if you're really wealthy, there's some good news for you at the IRS. And that is Donald Trump and his buddy Elon are gutting the IRS, tearing apart the agency that ensures that rich folks pay their fair share in taxes so they can't and don't scam the system. Well, by firing thousands of IRS employees, thousands of tax collections of rich folks will never occur. and billions of dollars that could be used to help our communities will never materialize. They're gutting it so that they can say it doesn't work, and then they can gut it even further, all to reward their billionaire friends. But it's worse than that. Much like the DOJ, it seems clear the Trump team has every intent of weaponizing the IRS to go after their enemies. They can order audits against people who speak out, protect those from audits who toe the line. Those attacks won't be just on big business, but also prominent political enemies. They could come for anyone who dares to speak out. A small business that sells a product they don't like, a nonprofit that supports a cause they don't like, they get an audit. But the president's wealthy buddies, no, they do really well. But this gutting of the IRS, this tax giveaway to people by gutting the IRS, this isn't the biggest con. This isn't the biggest con, not by a long shot. Because the biggest con involves trillions of dollars. And that, of course, is the tax cut. How they pay for it and how they don't. Donald Trump, who solicited untold sums from billionaires in the form of campaign contributions and shady schemes to enrich himself, delivers in a way that those donors could hardly imagine. Massive tax cuts for the wealthiest among us, paid for by cutting Medicaid and other vital services, and by borrowing a ton of money from your kids and grandkids, sinking the nation further into debt. Tax cuts for billionaires and more. Well, if you're one of them, that's great news. That means time to buy another yacht, or maybe another vacation home, more money to invest in the stock market, and they may need to, given what the Trump tariffs are doing in the market right now. But that's what their contributions bought them, a few billion here and a few billion there. And pretty soon we're talking about serious money for these wealthy donors and large corporations. But the thing is, these tax cuts aren't free. Yeah, they're using this phony math they call the current policy baseline. It's a phony math that says if you spent $3,000 on a vacation last year, you can spend another $3,000 this year and it won't cost anything because it's the current baseline in your family. But the reality is these tax cuts aren't free. Somebody's going to pay for them. Well, it won't be the real wealthy that pay for them. Everyone else is going to pay for them. Working Americans are going to see their costs skyrocket. They're going to see their retirement accounts plummet and their Social Security and Medicaid ripped apart to give more money to billionaires. And here's the thing, they don't even pretend anymore. They are happy to admit that their multi-trillion-dollar check that they're about to write to billionaires will be paid for by everyone else. Not just in dollars, but in the programs you rely on, programs you paid into your whole life. Medicaid on the chopping block, Social Security, offices closing, phone lines unanswered. They want it to slowly die on the vine. Food assistance going the way of the dodo bird, and the list goes on and on and on. Life will get harder and harder. That is, of course, unless you're a multi-billionaire who wrote a big check to Donald Trump, which, if he doesn't bring about a global recession, just might turn out to be a pretty damn good investment. During his campaign, Donald Trump promised his wealthy donors that he'd make them even richer by cutting their taxes. He invited many of them to his inauguration. Some even got to stand on the stage with them as he was sworn in. This is who Donald Trump is for. He is for them. He is for the really, really rich. That is whom he represents. We are for you. I yield back.
Madam President.
Senator from Vermont.
Thank you. Madam President, let me say a few words about where we are as a nation, what this budget resolution does, and why I am strongly opposed to it. Madam President, as you may know, we have more income and wealth inequality in our country today than we have ever had in the history of America. 3 people on top own more wealth than the bottom half of American society. Top 1% owns more wealth than the bottom 90%. CEOs now make about 300 times more than their workers. In other words, the very rich becoming much richer, and working families are struggling. So what does this budget resolution do to address this very serious crisis? Does it help working people? Does it help low-income people? No, not really. It actually makes income and wealth inequality much worse by providing massive tax breaks to the billionaires and the richest people in this country, driving up the national debt, and making those on top very, very happy. Madam President, in America today, the richest country in the history of the world, we have 60% of our people living paycheck to paycheck, struggling every week to put food on the table, to pay the rent, to deal with childcare, to take care with health care. Madam President, real wages, real inflation accounted for wages for the average American worker have been stagnant for the last 50 years, despite a huge increase in worker productivity. And today, all across this country, you have workers working for 11, 12, 13 bucks an hour, working for starvation wages. Some of them are actually sleeping in their cars. Now, how does this budget resolution address the crises facing working families? Well, at a time when many workers are struggling to find affordable housing, what this budget will do is cut back on housing programs, making it harder for working people to get decent housing. It will cut funding for low-income and affordable housing. So it makes life more difficult for millions of working families. Madam President, at a time when 22% of our seniors are trying to survive on less than $15,000 a year, and that's really quite shocking. It's something we don't talk about, something that we don't deal with here in Congress. Can you imagine a senior citizen trying to survive on $15,000 a year, when seniors need additional health care, when seniors need to keep their homes warmer? They have all kinds of issues trying to get by on $15,000 a year. 22% of seniors are in that position. Half of seniors are trying to get by on $30,000 a year or less. So how does this legislation, this budget, help seniors? What does it do for seniors? Well, it makes it a bad situation much worse. This legislation, this budget, will make it much harder for seniors to receive the care they desperately need in nursing homes. In Vermont, and I expect in most states in this country, we have a major nursing home crisis. Nursing homes are shutting down. Harder and harder for people to get into nursing homes. Well, when you cut Medicaid by $880 billion, you're going to make it much, much harder for seniors to access nursing homes, because 2 out of 3 seniors are dependent upon Medicaid to get into nursing homes. This legislation would also cut back on nutrition programs for seniors at a time when many seniors are having a hard time affording the food that they need. And maybe worst of all, at a moment when Mr. Musk and his billionaire friends are laying off thousands of workers at the Social Security Administration, closing down Social Security offices all over the country, making it harder for people with disabilities and older people to get the benefits that they have paid into for their whole lives. This bill does nothing to address that crisis. Madam President, we right now, embarrassingly, have the highest rate of childhood poverty of almost any major country on earth. A little bit embarrassing, we're the richest country on the face of the earth. We have more income and wealth inequality than any other country. We're seeing a significant growth in the number of billionaires we have, but in terms of our kids, we have the highest rate of childhood poverty of almost any major nation. Now, how would this budget impact our children? Well, it would make a bad situation even worse by throwing millions of kids off the health care that they have. That's what happens when you cut Medicaid by hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. This budget would cut nutrition programs that 1 out of every 5 children depend upon. Amazingly, sadly, in America, a lot of kids go to school hungry, and this legislation would cut nutrition programs. Furthermore, for working families, this legislation would do nothing to address the outrageously high cost of childcare in America. And by the way, it would make devastating cuts to education, I think significantly in working class communities. Madam President, it is no secret to anybody that our current healthcare system is far and away the most expensive in the world. We spend about twice as much per capita on healthcare as almost any other nation. Most Americans understand and deal with the reality every day that our healthcare system is dysfunctional. It takes forever to get a deal with the insurance companies and get your claims processed. It is extremely cruel. A significant number of people who are struggling with cancer end up going bankrupt because they cannot afford the outrageous cost of the hospital care that they have received. So what does this budget do to address our broken and dysfunctional healthcare system? Well, hard to believe, but it makes a terrible situation even worse. By cutting Medicaid up to $880 billion, this legislation could force as many as 36 million Americans off the health care that they currently have. Now, right now, we got 85 million Americans who are uninsured or underinsured. That number would soar. So, low-income working people don't have a lot of money. What happens when they get sick? We lose 60,000 people a year right now, despite Medicaid, who don't go to a doctor when they should because they can't afford to. This budget would make that situation much, much worse. And at a time when we have a massive crisis in primary healthcare, not enough doctors, not enough nurses, not enough mental health counselors, not enough primary care facilities where people can get into a doctor when they need. By cutting Medicaid, this legislation would make access to community health centers, something that I've worked on for a very long time, make it harder for people to access community health centers because community health centers are highly dependent on Medicaid for their funding. Madam President, virtually every scientist who has studied the issue has made it clear that climate change is an existential threat to our planet. And I understand that the current president of the United States thinks that it is a hoax originating in China, but that is not what 99.5% of the scientists who study the issue believe. And as we look around and see year after year becoming warmer, the last 10 years, warmest on record, when we see the terrible flooding and drought and extreme weather disturbances taking place in our country and all over the world, the American people understand that climate change is all too real and is having devastating impacts on our lives. So, what does this legislation do to address the extraordinary crisis that we face in terms of climate change? Well, hard to believe, but it makes a bad situation even worse by opening up vast swaths of public land to big oil companies so they can drill, baby, drill. And it opens up public lands to more and more oil companies. Brilliant. We face an existential threat, and this legislation makes that threat even worse. Well, it seems to me, Madam President, that instead of passing this absurd budget proposal, we should move in exactly the opposite direction that this proposal takes us. Instead of making life more difficult for the working class of our country, instead of rewarding the billionaire campaign contributors who fund many, many campaigns around here, maybe, just maybe, we should represent the needs of our constituents, the working families of this country. And one of the ways that we could do it is by raising the minimum wage to a living wage. I know that is around here a very radical idea. Imagine that. We raise the minimum wage, which is today at the federal level, $7.25 an hour. So we're going to be offering an amendment to raise the minimum wage to a living wage, $17 an hour. And maybe instead of making it harder for working families to find affordable housing, maybe, just maybe, we should build millions of units of low-income affordable housing. Maybe, just maybe, instead of making it harder for families to access childcare, we should make it easier and more affordable. And maybe instead of cutting Medicaid by $880 billion, maybe instead of doing that, we should do what virtually every other major nation on earth does. And that is understand that healthcare is a human right, that every man, woman, and child is entitled to healthcare as a human being. And we can do that by passing a Medicare for All single-payer program. The function of a healthcare system should not be to make the insurance companies and the drug companies much wealthier. It should be to provide quality healthcare in a cost-effective way to all of our people. So there you go. What we have is a budget proposal in front of us which makes bad situations much worse and does virtually nothing to protect the needs of working families. But what it does do, of course, is reward wealthy campaign contributors by providing over $1 trillion in tax breaks to the top 1%. You know, I'm going to vote against this proposal, that's for sure. And I wish my Republican friends the best of luck when they go home, if they dare to hold town meetings and explain to their constituents why they think at a time of massive income and wealth inequality, it's a great idea to give tax breaks to billionaires and cut Medicaid and education and other programs that working families desperately need. I do wish them the very best of luck as they go forward in that way. Madam President, with that, I would yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Louisiana.
Madam President, our country has had some pretty severe economic challenges of late. I'm not talking about the recent stock market losses, although those are quite important for someone with a 401k. I'm talking about how real Americans, average Americans, feel as if the American dream of home ownership, of buying a new car or truck, buying their child a car, affording a student loan, is just slipping out of their grasp. We saw this fear during the Biden administration when inflation was so high, the Federal Reserve increased interest rates. And as these interest rates rose, so did consumer interest rates on all sorts of things, directly impacting the ability of a family to realize the American dream. This speech is about how do we preserve that ability of Americans to achieve that dream, and how what we are doing today, tonight, in this Congress directly impacts that. Now, it may seem pretty distant to someone watching from home, but it does directly impact that. How much money the federal government borrows, how much this budget resolution leads to increased indebtedness, that sounds abstract, but it impacts your ability to buy that home, to buy that car, to attend that school. And some of the process discussions that normally wouldn't work, how does Congress do this? How does it do that? If you're not in Congress, they're actually extremely important to this discussion of how much we are going to borrow and how much we are going to enable Americans in Louisiana, the state I'm privileged to represent, and elsewhere, achieve their dream. Let me explain. As our country borrows more money, so we pass something and our debt explodes. And as our country has to borrow money to pay for that debt, it begins to compete with businesses, with individuals, with families, as they also go out and try and borrow money. Now, the federal government's always going to get the first amount, and it is going to be the others who have to pay more to compete. And paying more means you pay more for your mortgage, you pay more for your car note, you pay more for your student loan interest rate. The only way to keep this from happening is for the federal government to live within its means. I think the inflation of the last 4 years is one of the principal reasons the American people tossed Joe Biden out and they put Donald Trump back into the White House. The Biden administration did not live within its means, borrowed a lot of money, drove up interest rates. The American people couldn't afford that which they expected to be able to buy. They voted for change. Now, President Trump understands this. When he spoke to Congress last month, spoke of renewal of the American dream. And in that speech about renewing the American dream, he spoke about having a balanced budget. He understands, he desires, he sees the connection between living within our means and making it good for fellow Americans. And by the way, I agree with him. I agree that balancing the federal budget is key to preserving that dream. So why is this important now? Our country, right now, not tomorrow, right now, is $36 trillion in debt. 36 trillion with a T. And if we do nothing, if all we do is status quo, continue on the path we're on, it is estimated we will add $21 trillion to that indebtedness over the next 10 years. Now, what about today? We're going to vote on a budget resolution tonight. If we vote on that budget resolution and it leads to a reconciliation bill, which is not paid for, we will add another $5 to $11 trillion. On top of that, 36 trillion plus 21 trillion, we could end up with 65 to almost $70 trillion of indebtedness 10 years from now if we don't do that right. I'm a doctor. I'm going to borrow a term from medicine. I'm going to adapt it, if you will. That would be congressional malpractice. We do not want to be guilty of congressional malpractice. Now, at some point, the problem begins to build upon itself. Currently, a fifth of tax revenue is used to pay interest on the debt. 20% of all the money the federal government gets is right now being used to pay interest on the debt. That is more than we spend on national defense. I'm going to repeat that one. Right now, we're paying more, paying back people who lent us money, than we're paying to protect our country and to pay the troops who are doing so. There's a historian, Niall Ferguson, who says that when a country is spending more on debt service than on defending itself, that is the mark of a country in decline. Current Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent made a similar point in a Fox News op-ed. He wrote that, quote, America's next security crisis is lurking in our pocketbooks, that our escalating debt crisis hurts national security in three key ways. It diminishes our financial surge capacity. It robs our private sector of capital for productive investment, and it imperils America's preeminent role in international financial markets. Well, Scott Bessent is now Secretary Bessent, and he is right. The debt is a threat to our national security and to the economic security of the American family. By the way, families know this. You might be in Caddo Parish, Louisiana, you might be in Covington, Louisiana, but they've learned to live within their means, and we should learn something from those Louisiana families. So let's discuss the budget resolution before us. Now, to be sure, this resolution only sets up a discussion of a reconciliation bill. And the reconciliation bill is where we actually establish how much is spent and where it should be spent. Nevertheless, this budget resolution points in a direction and establishes certain parameters. Now, at this point, I'm going to discuss a little bit about process. And there's been a lot of debate in Washington about using current policy versus current law as baseline in this budget resolution. Now, current policy has never been used as baseline involving this much money and in a reconciliation bill. And I'm going to show a chart here. In this chart, this is the years over here. This is 2025 going all the way out to 2055. And this is how much our debt is as a percent of our tax revenue. And you can see that if this is what the Congressional Budget Office says is our current trajectory, that in 2055, we'll have a debt to GDP ratio of about 156%. That under what we're looking at could increase that to 211 to 230%. So this is the trajectory on, which is not great. But if all we do is what we're doing today without any effort to offset it, we would increase this 210 to 230%. Now, somewhere around 174%, the economists say we're in trouble. To borrow a gastroenterological term, I'm a gastroenterologist, we're in deep doo-doo. And in that is what we have to worry about. Now, I've discussed this extensively with my Senate colleagues. I'm pleased to say there is a commitment from President Trump and the White House to work with senators to go through the budget line by line to see where there can be savings. The White House and Congress have committed to working together to decrease the regulatory hassle that keeps a business from starting a new venture, to create more jobs, to hire more people, to give them better salaries. Let's cut that red tape and allow those businesses and those workers to achieve their potential. And doing so increases revenue. When people are making more money, they pay more taxes. Clearly, the president's working hard now to make the government work more efficiently, again, which saves us money. I have been assured that there is a commitment in other ways to pay for the eventual reconciliation bill. Now, I am not saying that I think that it is better that we use current policy as baseline. It's never been done before in a setting like this. I think it establishes a dangerous precedent. It might be within the rules to do so, but it doesn't mean it's wise to do so. And as a conservative, I know sometimes that even if you can open Pandora's box, it's better not to. Put differently, just because you can doesn't mean you should. But it appears we're going to do that. Also, using current policy as baseline should not suggest to us that the current tax code is perfect. I would say far from it. According to publicly available information, Jeff Bezos, the second richest man in the world, got a child tax credit several years ago. Now, tax credits for children are supposed to go to middle income and lower income families, not to the second richest man in the world. I hope as we go through this, we can modify that. Let the dollars go where they're needed, not to someone who is obviously wealthier than any of us put together. All that said, this vote's not taking place in a vacuum. It's taking place when the stock market has had 2 successive days of greater than 1,500 points decline. This kind of crashing stock market creates uncertainty, which makes companies less likely to invest, which makes it less likely that new jobs will be created. And creating new, good-paying jobs is essential to that individual, that family enjoying the American dream. Upon consideration, and given the commitment from leadership, I would say that not passing this budget resolution could increase the uncertainty in the economy, and that is something I do not wish to do. And given the commitment from leadership to pay for this bill by a variety of mechanisms, whether it is from within the reconciliation vehicle or outside of that process, and once more, the need to reestablish confidence among those creating jobs, I will vote for this budget resolution. And as we move on from this budget resolution to the reconciliation bill, I will look to make sure that we are truly paying for it and addressing the national debt. And to that end, let me kind of mention something as an aside. No, not as an aside, as directly impacting this conversation. I encourage the use of America's abundance as a way to increase the possibility of Americans achieving the American dream, and as a way to also help pay for the government we now have. One example, I applaud President Trump for advocating greater exploration of oil and gas on federal lands. This creates great paying jobs. It is a tax base for communities, and it generates significant revenue for the federal government. Not by raising taxes, and it doesn't cut benefits, but by exploiting, if you will, in a positive way, the resources we have to produce that which is essential to living a modern life. I have also proposed in other settings, other solutions that can address our nation's indebtedness without raising taxes or cutting benefits. Again, I've spoken to these in the past. I will speak to them in the future. I want America to be great for all Americans, that we can all live to the limits of our God-given gifts. Creating opportunity is part of this. My hope, my expectation is that through this process we are currently in, we will create more opportunity for every American to express his or her God-given gifts and to achieve the American dream. With that, I yield.
Madam President,
Senator from Massachusetts.
Madam President, are we in a quorum?
We are not.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, Social Security is under attack. Donald Trump, Elon Musk, and Doge are revving up their chainsaw and coming after America's earned Social Security benefits. They are cutting staff, slashing services, closing offices, and lying about the program. 10 days from now, the Doge chainsaw is threatening to cut phone services at the Social Security Administration. Cutting the phone services at the Social Security Administration, jeopardizing benefits that seniors earned through a lifetime of work. In 2023, do you know how many people died waiting for their Social Security benefits? 30,000 Americans. What do we think now about doing away with 1-800 phone service? And what will that do to wait times that are already too long? Yesterday, I just decided to get on and to dial 1-800 and just see how long it would take for a United States senator to be able to connect with the Social Security Administration. It was a half hour, it was an hour, and then they just said, there's at least a 2-hour wait. Well, for grandma and grandpa, we just don't want them waiting a couple of hours or more in order to get the information they need about, for most of them or a lot of them, the only check in their life, the only thing that keeps them with the capacity to be able to pay for the groceries, the rent, or even for the phone service. But at the Social Security Administration, over the last 8 weeks, it's now 1-800, dial the number, and then just wait. So the administration is then forcing people to, instead of being able to use the phone, they're saying, get online, grandma. And then grandma is saying, oh, you know what? I forgot to take that computer course 30 years ago, and I'm 88 now. But they're saying, you got to learn how to go online, grandma. Well, no Social Security benefits because we're cutting off the phone service. Or drive. Just get out there in the car. And some of the Social Security offices are a couple of 100 miles away from people. But that's the plan. We're 10 days away from that being put into place. And that's even if the field office is still open for Social Security, because they're planning on cutting the field offices as well, just for people to be able to access their earned benefits. And why is this happening? Well, because of the lie that Social Security is rife with fraud. That is a lie just like claims of fraud made by President Trump when he said someone was listed in the Social Security system at age 360. So let me say that again. He claimed someone was 360 years old, older not just than the entire Social Security program, but older than the United States of America, because that person would have had to have been born in 1659. But yet Trump